All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday. Yes, Friday. Friday, January 2nd. And how's it looking out there? Is it getting crazier? How's the year starting?
Let's see, getting crazier. It's always getting crazier. I think, the only thing you can say for sure. And I think that's the one forecast that I can make with confidence, for this year, this upcoming year of 2026. Um, yeah, there's a lot going on as always. There was, we talked recently about the strike on Putin's Valdai residence in the Novgorod region. Interestingly, the CIA came out or leaked a bit of information about that to the Wall Street Journal. They claimed that those drones were not headed towards his residence, but towards something else, some kind of military target within the Novgorod region, in the area of his residence. That's possible, but it could very easily be a lie. I mean, this is this is the CIA after all, and which we have learned over the course of this conflict is very deeply involved in this conflict, is very much a part of the Ukrainian intelligence networks and establishment. So to think that they're somehow a disinterested, observer, that they can be relied on to provide impartial analysis is, of course, ridiculous. They're very much involved in this. They're a party to this conflict. So sometimes, the truth is in their interest, and they do actually release facts. That happens, but just as often they fabricate them. So it's actually, I would say that it's actually an admission. What we can take from it is an admission that the drones there was an attack on the Novgorod region in the area of his residence, and I think there's no reason. It actually kind of firms up the Russian claims that they were attacking the residence, because they've admitted to 90% of it. And I there was some question whether or not the drones were there at all, and now it's clear that they are. The CIA is admitting that they did enter Novgorod.
Yeah, everyone seems to have their panties in a bunch over this incident. And, I expressed this on our last talk that I felt like it was a bit overblown, because we've seen Ukraine do these types of things. And to be honest, to me, the more horrific incident was the New Year's attack that occurred in eastern Ukraine, where something like close to 40 people were killed, including multiple children burned alive. It was a clear, war crime. This was something in a civilian attack.
Yeah.
And I've heard people make the argument. I've heard other dissident analysts say that, well, okay, this was also, not, we have to look at it in the framework that this was attack on one of Russia's command and control bunkers, that this was actually an attack on their nuclear triad. And okay, well, first off, if it is a command and control bunker, like, a drone's not going to take out a command and control bunker. So it's like, that doesn't make sense to me. And then for me, like, the Operation Spiderweb, that was an actual attack on Russia's nuclear triad. We saw this, and it was clear that MI6 was heavily involved, probably the CIA. And for me, that was a big incident. Visually, we all saw it, the explosion, these Tupelo bombers exploding, nuclear capables, and just this very, elaborate plot attack, with these drones. And we didn't really see Russia respond in any significant fashion to that. But here, I think the difference is that Russia is in a different mindset, and they now have learned that they will respond in a significant fashion. Maybe they should have done that before, and I think that's why everybody's, the CIA is rushing out saying, "Oh, wait, don't overreact, don't say this." In Ukraine as well, saying, "Oh, we didn't do it," and try to play this down.
Mm-hmm.
And even Trump, he had that, we initially saw him say he was really upset with Ukraine. What are they doing? I heard it from Putin. And then I don't know if you saw this, he truthed, one of the last truths of the year, at the end of the day, December 31st. It was the New York Times article. I don't think it was Wall Street Journal. Maybe, it doesn't matter. But he retweeted in the article was, Putin attack bluster shows Russia's the one standing in the way of peace. That's what Trump tweeted, so he just switched already, if we go by his true social tweets. And
yeah, right. Yeah, no, I noticed that post. That was actually the New York Post. I believe that it was an editorial in the New York Post that you're referring to at the end. 3 different New York publications that we're talking about here. Okay, it doesn't really matter. One, just a very quick correction. The death toll, or the current death toll from the attack in Kherson, is now stands at 27, not 40. But it's horrific, and we can get into that a little bit more. But let's first, continue our discussion about the Valdai attack. One thing that maybe the CIA is trying to do is even just sow doubts in the minds of the Russians. The Russians concluded, hey, they were on a trajectory that ended at President Putin's residence. And, they've reacted very forcefully. And then the CIA say, okay, well, they know they were headed in that direction. Let's say, let's claim that they were actually, the target was maybe 10 miles away or something, and at least maybe sow some doubt, some confusion then, and that could, that's just one possibility. I'll just put that out there. Just came to mind. But there is another possible reason anyway, for the anger and the strong reaction to this attack in contrast to previous attacks. And that is, as many, especially in Russian social media, pointed out, the attack occurred while President Trump was talking to Zelensky in Miami. And that prior to that, he had spoken to Putin on the phone. And then they had agreed that when the conversation or, the meeting with Zelensky was over, that Trump would call him back. And so it was during that time period, while Putin was waiting for this phone call, and that the attack occurred. And so some have said that maybe this is similar to what we've seen in the past, the Americans using negotiations and discussions as actually as a means for carrying out attacks on the opposite side. That's say, that Putin is going to be here. He's waiting for the call, and perhaps you actually determined his location from the call. And now you're attacking him. Again, that's speculation. There's no proof of that, but it's a possibility. And it certainly seems to be a lot of Russians who believe it. And that may explain to some extent the intensity of the response. But I think you're right. It's mainly a different mindset. It's just that the Russians, especially Putin, more than anybody else, was really looking for a diplomatic solution. And so he was trying to play down all these provocations, but it just seems like he's given up on that, and he's shown we have a different Putin, a Putin that has become, let's say, much more cynical, and I think a lot of people would say realistic, and is going to respond in some, I think, forceful fashion to this attack, probably within the next couple of days.
Do you think Trump believes his own intelligence agencies? Why does he have this faith? He'll listen to will agree with Putin, and then the next day he just flip flops. And it just seems to me also that the intelligence agencies, they were out to get Trump for years. We had the whole Russiagate hoax, and then that's why I think many people were hopeful that when Trump would come in, that he would be wary and say, okay, these people were out to get me, and now I'm in power, and then I'll take them out and, scatter the CIA to the winds kind of thing. But instead, it sounds like he's just, as soon as he got power, he's like, okay, now you guys are on my team.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, he flip-flops. It seems, okay, there was a very, very interesting, very long article that came out in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. This time it's the New York Times. It was on... It was really about the Trump and his administration and their relationship with Russia and Ukraine. And it seems clear that he really does, that Trump, together with some of his aides, in particular Vance, and some of the people that Vance has kind of selected and seated into, let's say, the Defense Department and other agencies, want to get out of the Ukraine conflict. I think the main reason is that, again, they just see it as a losing proposition. It's a drain on American resources, and the U.S. should be focusing on other regions, especially China, but also the Middle East. So I think that really is his general orientation. He wants to do it. But other parts of his government, and the CIA above all, are very closely tied to Ukraine. We talked about that recently. They really built up that agency, and they're almost, joined at the hip there in Ukraine. They want to stay in Ukraine, and they work, to undermine negotiations, essentially. And then very strangely, Trump kind of, maybe what he's thinking, or he gets convinced to say, okay, Putin's not moving. You want this peace deal. Let's put some pressure on him. Let the CIA carry out these attacks. And according to the New York Times, the CIA was heavily involved on the attacks on the oil refineries, but also on the civilian tankers. And that I find remarkable. I mean, that would be leaked. I mean, just imagine, like, if the news came out that the Russians were, attacking our civilian tankers, that there was direct evidence of that. They would imagine the outrage. That's a huge provocation right there. And just the fact that the CIA would leak this, in detail to the New York Times suggests that they really do want to worsen relations between the U.S. and Russia. They're working at cross purposes to Trump's general instincts. It's just, again, Trump is inconsistent. So sometimes, he, and I think maybe also doesn't have much control over them, or doesn't, monitor them closely enough. They do things on their own, or they convince him that something's going to help his project, when obviously it isn't. But they're still there, and they're still, working to further the Ukraine project.
Well, if there's even an admission or a leak that the U.S., the CIA, is involved in terrorist attacks and attacks on Russia and civilian tankers, how does Russia respond to something like this? How do they go to war with the CIA as well? Because essentially that's what's happening.
Yeah. Well, that's hard. Well, of course, they have responded to the attacks on tankers. It's just that there's now a semi-blockade in effect on Odessa, and Odessa is very, very important to the Ukrainian economy. 90% of agricultural exports go through there, and a lot of the other exports and imports, including military equipment imports, go through the Odessa port. And there's some smaller ports, nearby, but those too have been attacked. So they did respond. They didn't. We don't know that they went against the CIA. It's not clear, what they could do, but, maybe there are things that, who knows what goes on in that murky world. But there was a response, in the case to that, a very serious, formidable response to the attacks on the tankers.
Yeah, well, something that always gets brought up is just how long will Russia go along with this idea that the U.S. is just some benevolent mediator between Ukraine and Russia, when we're clearly the one that's orchestrating the majority of this war, and we're the one that's keeping it going. At some point, I think Russia needs to drop that pretense, mm-hmm. right? And will they, something, for example, they could do is they're saying, okay, well, you're arming your proxy Ukraine to the hilt to attack us. It looks like you're ready to invade Venezuela. Well, let's start arming Venezuela. Let's give them hypersonic capability, or something like this, a missile, ship destroying missiles that they can arm. And all of a sudden that changes the calculus of everything. Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah. I don't know. You talk about this pretense. It's true. It's, it's ridiculous. The U.S. is, up to its eyeballs in this conflict. It's, clearly, more than just supporting Ukraine. It's involved directly in these attacks on on Russia, not just the Russian forces in Ukraine, but on Russian territory, Russian-linked tankers and so on and so forth. I think it's, maybe the way the Russians are looking at it is that they do see a change and maybe a possible opportunity with here with Trump. That Trump
Really?
has shown a willing, yeah, well, okay, maybe that's foolish, but has shown a willingness. I think there is he does in fact want to make a deal, and so they're kind of they're playing this game, kind of playing along with this pretense, just to maybe to stay on Trump's good side, or that's what they've been doing for some time. I don't know. I suppose, maybe they're not going to get anything out of him, but perhaps at least you don't want to have an enraged Trump. If you just kind of go after him directly, as we've spoken before, he's the kind of person, he doesn't like to be directly challenged. Say that, throw down the gauntlet and say, no, you're not going to do this. You can't do this. We're in charge here. Perhaps, there's a real risk that you're going to set him off and that he's going to supply the tomahawks and whatever, escalate in a big way. He has put the brakes on some of the more hawkish elements in his administration to this point, but he might just remove those brakes if you don't continue to play this game. That's the only answer I can give.
But how can the Russians think that they could possibly make a deal with Trump when we just take this one attack, for example?
Yeah.
He has a call with Putin, comes out and says, oh my God, this was horrible. Yeah, why would Ukraine do this attack? And then a day later or 2 days later, he tweets out, Putin attack bluster shows Russia is the one standing in peace. And basically saying that, Russia, you are lying about this attack. And if Russia clearly has the evidence, and if they send the tracking data to them and say, you guys know, maybe you were involved in this. And then you just come out and just say that we are the ones lying. How do you expect us to make any type of deal? How are we supposed to have any type of security guarantee in place if when there is an attack, you will immediately say that we're lying and that it's, nothing that Ukraine does is wrong. And so it's impossible. I know. It's impossible. There's no deal, right?
Yeah. Well, I would just say actually about that editorial, they didn't outright say that the Russians were lying. They said that it was highly unlikely, but they admitted it was a possibility that was true in that editorial. But they made it actually a more extraordinary statement, that an attack on Putin's person may well be justified. Assassinating the president of this nuclear power. So that's actually even worse. Well, again, I don't think that they have any real hope for a deal at this point. I think that's gone. Including Putin. They don't. But what I'm just saying is that, okay, they know that Trump's going to flip flop. They've seen him do it again and again. But then, he'll come back. He'll put the brakes on, on military supplies to Ukraine. That's actually a significant development. That is something that has happened, that the U.S. has basically overall cut its flow to the Ukrainian armed forces, the flow of materiel to the UAF. Of course, it's continuing through other means. The Europeans can buy it from the Americans, but that has slowed down the flow. That is significant. That's real. And that's a decision that Trump and his people made. And you say, okay, we're not going to have a deal, but if we can at least, not have him as an enemy, we don't want him to fly into a rage and then decide that we're the source of all the problems. He gets pissed at Putin, but he's even more pissed at Zelensky. And that's something that is actually overall to our advantage somewhat. Okay, no deal, but he does make life difficult for Zelensky. So let's just try to keep on his good side.
Yeah. I always come to this debate on whether or not, is it better to have sort of this sort of attempt to manage a slow decline of the empire, or is it better just to rip the Band-Aid off? Because, eventually we say you want to go slow, but we see also a slow escalation. And then that's the risk of sleepwalking into a disaster. If we continue down this path where it's just like, okay, it's dragging on for another year or 2 years. And then all of a sudden we're at this point where, okay, I guess, the talk of war has been in the air so long that it just happens? Or does Russia just be a bit more forceful and say, like, this, we're done playing games. This is over. We're turning the lights off in Ukraine and we're ending this thing now. And then, that's okay, a big escalation. What will the West do in response? But I think for me, I'm starting to move into the camp that, okay, it's time to go faster now. It's this needs to end, because this slow process, we are seeing ourselves slowly sleepwalk into a larger conflict. The longer that constant rhetoric to prepare for war with Russia, that this is coming, it's inevitable, that will eventually seep into the psyche. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess that's just what we're doing. I've heard it for 4 years, and now here it is,
Right, right. Yeah, no, rhetoric has a way of becoming reality over time, statements that are constantly repeated start to, just penetrate into people's consciousness, and they take on an aura of inevitability. So yeah, I think there's a danger there. There's a danger that at some point the Western MIC or MICs, because when you talk about Europe, they don't have one unified military industrial complex, but they tend to be within the separate nations. But if that maybe with enough time, they might actually start to gear up and produce more weapons, and then
I don't think so.
The Russian. Yeah, maybe not, but it has been close to 4 years. But in any case, the longer it goes on, I understand that argument. I think it's a good argument. I don't reject it. I understand the opposite argument, which I think is what Putin is still Putin's position, and that first of all, we should go slow. There's a couple of reasons for that, because maybe a sudden expansion of the conflict or an acceleration of the conflict of Russian advances could have the effect of provoking a really reckless response on the part of the West. And that maybe it is better to just do this gradually. And we'll constantly hear all this, but they'll just get used to it, and eventually we'll take that part of Ukraine that we need to take, and then we can call it quits. But if it's just a sudden breakthrough, a big aero offensive, which I think Russia has a capability of doing, that just might, maybe that's what some of his analysts are telling him, that if that happens, they are going to NATO is going to send troops, or NATO member nations will send troops into Ukraine, and we'll have a larger conflict on our hand. So that's one argument in support of, let's say, Putin's more moderate, go slow position. Another is that those big aero offensives are very costly in terms of Russian lives. And that one reason why we do see these incremental advances is that, that's by so doing, you conserve the lives of your own men. And I think that's very, very important to Putin too.
Yeah, I understand. But I mean, eventually these incremental gains will lead to a collapse. And I think most people believe that is coming soon, that there are a lot of signs that the Ukrainian armed forces are on their last leg. I mean, one example you gave was just the fact that they sent essentially a PR unit to its death in Kupiansk, right?
Oh, not Kupiansk.
Guliopoly?
Guliopoly, right.
Right. So it's going to happen regardless, right? This collapse, and then we'll just have to see.
Yeah. Right. Well, I guess that's the other thing too, is that, I guess in recent statements, Putin's been very confident and about the military situation. And maybe that's what they see, is that they're getting close to that point, and say, well, why make the big push now? Perhaps maybe there will be this big push that we're talking about, and that Putin will support it. But he wants to do it when he's sure that the lines are really collapsing and there will be a minimum of resistance.
Yeah, it's just hard for me to see how Europe and the West will get more involved when, Ukraine is, as long as Russia doesn't attack the EU or the West directly, how can they, the West ever bring the justification to intervene? And I think Putin understands that. Just no justification. I'm sure Zelensky and probably a lot of people, leaders, elite in the West, almost wish that Putin would bomb Poland or something like this, so that way they
Right.
could get their casus belli and start World War III. But as long as that
Yeah.
Putin doesn't do that, then I just don't see how the West could ever build that justification to their population to go to war, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So far, I think that they see that they can't do it. Clearly, some of them want to do it, but the popular support isn't there. No, it's true. Maybe that could change at some point. But that's one reason I think why Putin has been very, very careful not to keep the conflict within Ukraine. He would actually, in fact, be justified in striking targets, outside of Ukraine, in Romania or Poland or wherever, because of the attacks that have been carried out, with direct involvement of NATO on pre-2014 Russian territory. So he would be justified, but he knows he doesn't see the point in doing that, because that could, as you say, provide him with that casus belli.
Right now, Russia has the ability to turn Ukraine's lights off completely. It sounds like it has reached that threshold that if it wanted to, it could just send a couple thousand drones and hit whatever substations left, and then it's done. Do you think that would be a wise move for Ukraine, for Russia to?
At this point, I don't think so. It's true that energy infrastructure is civilian, military, dual use, right? And that's why it is attacked in wars. And it must be said that the West does it, the U.S. does it. Actually did it. Much began attacks on energy infrastructure in places like Iraq and in Serbia much more quickly, much more immediately than the Russians have. So by shutting it down, you do impede military logistics. That's the main thing, because the logistics in Ukraine, like as in Russia, is largely dependent on the rail system. The rail system is electrified. So if you can't move troops around, you can't move equipment around, then you're in serious trouble. So that's a reason for doing this. But it is also civilian. That's the other. It's dual use, the other half, and we're in the middle of the winter, and most of that heating is dependent again on electricity. The people are already on a very reduced schedule throughout all of Ukraine. I don't think there's any place where there isn't some sort of daily blackout. And in many places, there's only a few hours a day when the electricity is on, and therefore the heat. To take it out entirely, could lead to, obviously to mass civilian suffering, but even to a great number of deaths, among the elderly, and for example. And so I think there is a great reluctance to do that. I think it's just, my guess, and I know other analysts have put this out there, is that they've taken it to the point, like you said, where they can just shut it off. They're within just a couple of missile and drone attacks of just shutting the whole thing down, and they want to have that option. Maybe for again the possible big aero offensive that may be coming at some point. Right before that, you shut it all down, and then you strike. Because normally, what would happen is that, okay, when the Ukrainians see, they're pushing through, here in Zaporozhye or in Dnipropetrovsk, we got to, send everything there, everything we have, throw it at them. Well, you shut down the turn off the lights, turn off the electricity, and they can't do it. They can't move their troops around and their military equipment around. And then you can just, that's obviously to the advantage of the Russians.
Yeah, if Russia is concerned about civilian casualties, which it's the way they've conducted this war shows that they are, perhaps the right way to do it would be during the summer. The winter is going to be tough regardless whether or not the lights are on, and then you finally get out of winter like, oh, thank God, what a horrible winter, and then boom, you shut out the lights, all of a sudden logistics are done, and then you can have a big aero offensive, like you said, and then the civilians at least aren't freezing to death. Of course they will be suffering, but it won't be to the level if it was in the middle of January or February. So, that does make sense to me. I think it'd just be also very demoralizing. And once that but I think it makes sense, because if you want to expedite an end to the war, I think if you do just shut down the energy infrastructure, that will force a rapid end to the war, right? I mean, you need electricity. You can't sustain a large operation without power. How are you,
Right.
even if NATO wanted to get involved at this point, it's like, well, I can't charge my phone. I can't text the general, whatever it is.
Right.
Obviously not that, but
Yeah.
you need a ton of power to operate
Right.
a large MIC. So
Right. Right. It's not just the logistics, but it's also military production. For example, there are all these small drone workshops and so on, which are very, very important to the Ukrainian military effort. And if they don't have electricity, they too will be unable to support the army on the front line.
yeah, that's what I would do. I would wait till summer, knock
It
out
may
the
happen.
grid.
Right. It's looking. Again, I know I'm cautious about predicting a collapse, but it just seems like we are getting really close to one, because it's not just the energy infrastructure. It's not just the manpower problem, which is, obviously, quite severe in Ukraine. It's not just those things. It's also the fiscal cliff and the military support that they're getting from the West. One thing that New York Times article showed is that some of the things that we've been saying here in dissident media about depletion of military equipment in the U.S. and in the EU and limited production capacity, that those things were true. Those were admitted to in that article. Say, for example, when coming to the Patriot interceptors that are very, very important for Ukraine, said that, they had run out, there wasn't a stockpile, and that the U.S. is only capable of producing maybe 50 a month. And, they have their other clients around the world, of course, Israel above all. They can't even give all those 50, but 50 is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It's just that it wouldn't be enough for one night. But that's all they had. And then it's just, there's an admission again in that article that, the stockpiles have been drawn down. And that's why Hegseth was saying, hey, we can't send any more of this or that. Some of those decisions were reversed, but not all of them. I think artillery shells, for example, he said that our stockpile is just too low. We can't do it. We need them for ourselves and for Israel, unfortunately. That's the way he would argue it. So just overall, it's a very grim picture. It looks very bad. I don't know, what could change it. It seems that we are on course for some kind of collapse. Not just, a collapse is brought about not by a single factor. It's multiple factors. And you look at everything. Every important factor to that is supporting the Ukrainians there on the front line, manpower, materiel, money, right, electricity. All of these things are just look like they're at the edge of a cliff. It does look very grim. It does look very grim. Now, some of those problems could theoretically anyway be solved. I think they're unlikely to be. For example, maybe the Ukrainians will just start conscripting the 18 to 24s, and they may get another 100,000 or 200,000 men out of that, and that could get them going for another year or two. That's a possibility, at least as manpower goes. Obviously, the Russians are in control of the whole question of energy infrastructure. They can turn it off at will when they want to. But it seems like, there's an unwillingness on the part of the U.S. to continue supporting this, and also a lack of capability. And then you see in Europe, their pockets are empty now. They just don't have. They want to send. Obviously these leaders want to, and that's why they actually really, some of them pushed hard to steal the Russian assets, because they really didn't have enough of their own. I mean, that just shows you it reveals their desperation.
But then why do they behave the way they behave? Why do they want to keep it going? Why do they keep on and refuse to, address, Russia's concerns, which they've been stating since the beginning?
Yeah.
The neutrality.
Yeah,
for
that's
Ukraine,
just fundamental. I'll tell you, I noticed that, like in just reading articles in the New York Times, or you read a speech given by a European leader. in their world, this was just a completely unprovoked grab of Ukrainian territory, by an aggressive expansionist state, and there's a moral imperative to resist it. Now, if you start explaining, try to bring in the context and say, well, wait a second, there's all this evidence that actually the Russians were in fact trying to give you, return, like, for example, the Donbass to Ukraine. That's really what the Minsk agreements were about. Let's not forget that. That was not something that was, that allowed Russia to seize territory or anything. It was quite the reverse. It was the people in Donbass wanted to be part of Russia, but the Russian government under Putin, did not want that to happen. And they were trying through the Minsk agreements to make a part of Ukraine. But anyway, just like there's all this context that completely, deflates or just disproves this assumption of theirs. But that you'll find it everywhere, and nobody seems to dare to go against it. If you begin to mention something like I just mentioned, then you're, that's a Russian talking point. You're a servant of Putin. It's just hard to realize sometimes, because we're outside of that information space. We're outside of that mindset. But within that information space, that is the way it is. That is their reality. And you just don't see anything. They work hard to prevent from anything leaking in, penetrating that space that they operate within. So again, they just see this is like they're faced with Hitler and they have to fight back. There's this moral imperative but fortunately their people don't seem to want to go along with them.
but then how did they also just sort of excuse and justify Israel? When you have these two conflicts juxtaposed, it's like, okay, maybe they could have gotten away with it a bit more, but I mean, just like when we see them turn a blind eye to what Israel's doing and talking about an expansionist power where these politicians in Israel are openly talking about making sure that there's not a single Christian or Muslim left in Gaza and that it'll all be Jewish and we'll take Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, and they're taking land in Lebanon, taking land in Syria, they're bombing every other 7 countries in a week. It's like, no. We won't talk about that. It's just the hypocrisy is just absurd.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. But that's, yeah, but they're one mind. I guess, if you surround yourself with like-minded people and you just talk to them all day, and then all the news stories that you read and the speeches you listen to, are by those like-minded people, it's amazing. You would think with some of these people are very intelligent, but they cannot see anything else. That's the reality that they inhabit. And then they're told that there are these other ideas, by being expressed by people like us, but these are bad people. These are people with wacky ideas. You don't want to go there. And the thing is, there are real consequences when you leave, that space and you start to express another idea. Then, all fingers point at you and you lose your status and you lose real power. You lose real influence. I know it's irrational, but it's real and it's powerful. Let me just put it that way.
Mm. Well, something that speaks a lot to people is the economy, this fiscal cliff. We've been talking about this. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the fiscal situation for Ukraine and the EU as a whole? You can expand to America if needed.
Yeah, well, Ukraine, obviously is an economy on life support. It cannot function on its own. So it's dependent on massive infusions of Western funds. So there is a shortfall in the budget, just to make sure that the agencies run well. The lights stay on. Well, maybe the lights can't even stay on because that's a whole other issue. But, figuratively speaking, that the lights will stay on in the government buildings, that they need these massive infusions of funds. And that's what that effort to get the 140 billion in euros, it was secured by Russian assets was all about. It was to make sure that shortfall was met and that the lights could stay on in Ukraine and that salary still could be paid and so on and so forth. Well, they ended up with this other measure, this 90 billion, which is, is less, and is surely it's a short-term solution, and it's not even clear that it's a solution. It's not clear where the money's coming from. The whole thing is, I think we're going to see another crisis probably in the next few weeks when they start to realize that nobody is going to put up that money. Because the whole thing, it's based on the assumption that the Russians are going to lose and are going to pay massive reparations. The Russians are going to pay it off. And I mean, can you think of any investor out there who would say, hey, this looks like a great, investment opportunity? Of course not. So I don't know where that money's going to come from. I think in the end, they're just going to have to pay it directly. But that's a problem. They're very reluctant to do that because, as they're saying, they want to, but their own people are not behind them on this, because to do it, they need to reduce all kinds of social benefits. And that is political suicide. So that's what we're looking at. They've already, failed to meet these needs that the Ukrainians have. And the situation is only going to get worse. I don't see how it can possibly get better. As the Russians advance, they take more and more territory. They're on the verge of laying siege to Zaporozhye, which is one of the major industrial cities of Ukraine, a very important part of its economy. And Zaporozhye is going to fall. It may not fall this year, but I think certainly it will fall sometime, probably soon afterwards. And then, and even before it falls, when a city is under siege, it no longer can function, as an economic center the way that it did before. So, say Zaporozhye will be lost to the Ukrainian economy before this year is up. And that's another blow. That's just one example. It's just like the whole trend is going against Ukraine. And then the attacks on, on different kinds of infrastructure, not just the energy infrastructure, will continue. The Russians have shown that they have this massive capability, to carry out these attacks regularly on a massive scale. And that is going to inflict, further harm. Everything is going negative, and at the same time, you see the Europeans coming up against this, fiscal reality. Theoretically, there is enough money in Europe. Yeah, they could do that, but there has to be political support for it, and there isn't. And they've just gone to great lengths, as we've seen, to try to finagle a way, to scheme, to get some funds there, and they failed. I think right there, that should be a flashing red light.
Do you think that this Ukraine war, how it ends, is it that it triggers a financial crisis, not just in Ukraine, but through the EU and potentially the United States as well, and it's the whole house of cards just comes tumbling down?
Well, certainly within the EU, we have two countries, both France and the UK. I think we have to say Italy. Italy is perennially in fiscal difficulties. It has very high debt. All of these governments are severely in debt. They have a debt that's unsustainable, and there already have been warnings that they may have to go to the IMF for a loan. That there tells you that. Europe is under a great deal of economic stress.
But Russia's economy is failing, right? Even though France has to go to the IMF for a loan. But
right. It's funny. It's not just during these last, nearly 4 years of the SMO that we've been hearing that. But it goes back. Certainly to 2014 and even before. I remember seeing headlines, Russia's economy is always on the verge of collapse. And they just continually repeat it to themselves. That's something that they need to believe in. But the truth is that Russia has outperformed Europe over these last few years, by a considerable margin. And Russia's fiscal situation is much sounder than the fiscal situation in Europe. They don't have the massive debt. They've been actually very careful about accumulating debt. Now, their deficits, they do have deficits, but they're minor, and manageable. So yeah,
So
it's
you think
now
that it,
I don't know. I won't make any. It's sort of a different situation again in the U.S. because of reasons that we've stated before. Again with the Europeans, they can't print their own money, and that's one reason why they're forced to face fiscal reality now, which is probably a good thing actually for them. It's like, okay, we want to give all this money to Ukraine, but that means we can't just print it. We need to take it from somebody else, and that somebody else is not happy about that. And if I do it, I'll be voted out of office. So that's something they're looking at. In the U.S., we have this ability to print money, but that won't last forever. And so the end is going to be different in the U.S. It could be actually worse, because we'll be tempted to just keep on printing money, and we could really, we could see hyperinflation here. That's a possibility. I'm not going to make any predictions when, but that's a real possibility. I think the collapse will take a different form in the U.S. than it will in Europe.
Well, I mean, Europe could print money. It's just that they would experience the effects of it more rapidly than the United States because it's not the world reserve currency, right? It just wouldn't be able to be absorbed into the system as quickly.
Yeah, well, they don't actually. I mean, that's because the effects are so immediate.
Yeah, but if let's see how desperate they get, because this often always happens before a true collapse. Is like, oh God, what we go? Well, there's somebody to raise his hand. It's like, why don't we just print it? And then then you go the way of Zimbabwe. But it seems like that always happens eventually. It was like, we'll just do it a little bit. And then it gets out of control,
Right, right. Well, I guess we can see the beginnings of that. I mean, again, Germany was always very fiscally responsible, I think in large part because of their experience of hyperinflation during the Weimar Republic. They decided never again, we're not going down that road. We're not going to get close to that, So they kept their spending under control, and they were very careful to balance budgets and limit, deficits, limit the debt. But that has been thrown out the window by Merz. They're still in a much sounder position than the rest of Europe because of all those years of caution, but that caution has been thrown to the winds. So eventually Germany will be in the same position.
Well, here in the U.S., what's been trending over the past couple of days is Tax Revolt 2026. And I'm excited about this movement picking up steam because it is crazy how much that the U.S., how all of us are being milked, all of us taxpayers, so much of our paycheck just automatically goes to the government. And then we see it being used to fund fraud and genocide. And not only that, our debt is increasing at an exponential rate. 38 trillion. I don't know. We're probably closing 39. We'll break 40 by the end of the 2026. So could this gain momentum and might bring the whole system down? Just like, or almost, do we have a moral duty at some point if we can see that all of our money is being used to fund death, murder, genocide, or just straight up fraud that's being exposed with this whole Somali daycare scandal that's happened in Minnesota? I mean, people are pissed. I'm pissed.
Okay. Well, I understand that. And the arguments in favor of withholding fund are quite powerful, but they're not realistic. I mean, the thing is you have to be prepared for a jail sentence if you actually, or seizure of assets, for severe penalties if you don't do it. That's the fact. Is that the tax authorities don't play around. There have been similar movements in the past. I remember, a lot of people talking in the same way during the Vietnam War when I was a kid, and I think some of them did, but then they pay the price. Now, it's a form of civil disobedience. If you're willing to pay the price, okay. But I think most of us aren't. And, people like you with families have to think twice about doing anything about it, and then probably shouldn't do it. But it does show this. It's another indication of dissatisfaction with the way things are. Who knows, at some point it might really pick up enough steam that even the tax authorities can't control it.
Yeah, I hope so, but you don't sound that hopeful.
Not in the near term. Yeah,
that everybody we act mad, but when it actually comes to it, we'll just grovel and just
because that's the reality. It's just that's right. I mean, that's truth. Now, with the case of any kind of revolution, there's always this that will be the reality for years and years. Maybe the majority of people are um, oppose the government, but they fear it, and nobody wants to be the one who steps out of line and gets shot or imprisoned. So everyone just keeps their mouths shut and goes on, and they keep their heads down and so on and so forth. But then there is this constant, let's say, buildup. This resentment grows, and and also just that majority becomes a super majority, and maybe people don't even realize it. But then one day there is somebody who steps out of line and says, "No, I'm not doing this," and then immediately it's just sort of the dam breaks and everybody rushes out and supports. They can't control themselves anymore. And then they realize, oh, we do have the numbers, and there's a revolution. That's one way that revolutions sometimes take place. So, I just don't see that we're there. I don't think we're anywhere close to there.
Yeah. Well,
but there may be a day.
I hope so. I mean, when you think about just historically, like, our war for independence, for example, the British try to tax our tea 3%. And we're like, what? I'm off to kill some Brits now. Like that was our reaction. 3% tea on our tax. And we're like, oh, that's not okay. And then you look at where we are now. And I think part of the problem, I think there's many things, but part of it is just that there is a sense of complacency or apathy in the U.S. that's been sort of nurtured via just lockdown and smoke weed, drink some booze, watch Netflix, and just forget about all these problems. There's a new season of Tiger King or something out. Get excited about that. And so people are just like, it's just too much trouble to have a revolution. So it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, it may only happen when, let's say, you can't get the booze, or Netflix gets switched off or something, and then people really start to suffer. And we're not there. It's just like, I think there's clearly a lot of the economy is faltering in many ways. Inflation is real and it's taken a real bite, of people's income, especially in the lower the lower dectiles, but all in all, this is still a prosperous country, and people can live lives of comfort and ease. If we apply a historical standard or even a global standard to it.
Yeah,
but at some point that may cease to be true.
Yeah, I know that if we just look in GDP terms, but something that I've just really noticed since I moved back to the U.S. Is just sort of the base amount of money that you have just to survive in this country is so high now. Because like in China, life was cheap, food was cheap, rent was relatively cheap. It was great, and then I come back here and it's just like, my mortgage, your health insurance, and then just the amount of tax that's getting taken out of every paycheck you get. It's just, it's crazy. Something that's actually been trending on Chinese social media is this theory of the kill line, because a lot of Chinese have been talking about, like, how is it that there's so many homeless people in the United States? Why don't they take, lower paying jobs? Why are they importing immigrant labor constantly, these undocumented workers? And what's been popularized in China is this idea of an execution line, kill lines. Like, once you drop below a certain threshold in the United States, especially if you have debt from student loans or your car or whatever, that, all of a sudden you are effectively out of the system. You're not able to open up a bank account, you don't have a car, and you just can't even function in this country. And it's true. I feel like you need to make, especially if you have a house or if you live in a city, you need to make at least $5,000 a month, I feel like, to be able to support a base, a family on something minimal. It's so hard here now in the States. So there is just that line. Once you just drop below that threshold, it becomes so hard. Something like 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. There's just no savings. It's just, I feel like it has to, and the disparity is getting larger, and this is what's going to happen as the economy begins to get worse and worse, and we print more and more money, asset prices inflate, and then there's going to be the people that do own houses, do own assets, that are going to become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and us poor people are going to be find it harder and harder to just pay for dinner, to pay your rent. It's because all that goes up and our salaries aren't going up. It's insane. So I just feel like we gotta. I hope there's enough people that are upset enough. I'm quite upset that we'll see some type of action. Maybe nothing will happen, this year, but I'm hoping that there will be something. You kind of popped my bubble a bit there, being a bit. Yeah, well, I think maybe it's just maybe it's my youthful naivete, and
sometimes it's sometimes that youthful naivete that actually moves history forward. You can put it that way. It just, I admit that maybe it's just that I become too cynical and pessimistic because I say, I've heard that all before. But one of these days, it'll happen. I mean, that's the way these things are. There are tipping points. And eventually we reach them. And who knows, we may be a lot closer to that tipping point than I understand. You may have your finger on the pulse, much more than I do. So I acknowledge that possibility.
When did the light go out of your eyes, Dad? When did the government extinguish all hope from you? Was there and will it happen to me? Is it inevitable?
I think that is kind of I think that is just the general the nature of things. Yeah, as you grow older, you probably become less and less. I wouldn't say idealistic. I'm just as idealistic, but I think I would say more realistic. But sometimes that realism can be, or what we take to be realism. Can turn out to have let's see, how should I put this? Well, maybe I should put it the other way. It's just like what we look at as youthful idealism, maybe a naivete, sometimes can be more realistic than our realism. It's just that we're so used to things being one way for so long that we forget that, things actually do change. History does move forward. Yeah, and they right, exactly. Revolutions occur, collapses occur, so on and so forth. I guess because I've heard talk of it for so long, I start to think, well, it's never going to happen. But I have to stop and tell myself, oh, it will happen one day.
And there's never been a time so ripe as now in your life, probably, right? You've never seen, because the empire is truly in crisis, is truly collapsing. So,
I think that's true.
Happen.
Again, right. Probably I had a lot of those foolish hopes, when I was young, but actually when I was young, looking back on it, and I think I even started to understand this at a relatively early age, the establishment was very secure. And it was actually overall pretty darn competent, very competent. But now it is not secure. It is, and I think it's becoming increasingly incompetent and divorced from reality. And we see it, all around, both on left and right. The liberal establishment in Europe is just as insane as the Trump administration, but in different ways. But just overall, the level of competence, the grasp on reality has really taken a dive in the West. And I think that maybe more than anything, it's just like if you had competent people in charge, okay, maybe we can, there are fixes to be made. We can change the course of the ship. We got to institute new policies, so on and so forth. They could be done and the situation could be salvaged. I think it really could. But you have to have competent people in charge, and we don't. These people are just an embarrassment, and there's no sign that that's going to change. And they are, it's not just, again, theoretical, but their actions already are having just, catastrophic effects on our economy, our soft power, and also, our military standing.
Okay. I want to ask just a quick question on the Middle East before we end today. I saw there's been some economic unrest in Iran. Is this significant? Because whenever I see something like this, I feel like, this is where, Israel goes into overdrive saying this is prime time for regime change. And now it's time to hit Iran because there's civil unrest. They're ready to overthrow the Ayatollah, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the unrest is real. Now, it may be exacerbated by outside agents, because there's obviously Israel, the U.S. has a history of, and a stated objective of supporting these kind of arrests and destabilizing Iran. But I think the unrest is real, and it's economic. There's real economic pain in Iran as a result of sanctions. So that's one of the things is the great hypocrisy is look at the angry Iranian people, protesting against their government. Is you hear the same thing about Venezuela, and then no mention that the suffering that's occurring there, the real economic distress is in large part, I wouldn't say entirely, but in large part due to sanctions that we impose. We were working to make them miserable. So this is part of the plan. Make them miserable, hope there are protests, support the protests, destabilize, the governments of those countries. I've heard that they have been greatly exaggerated. There are protests, but it's not nearly of the extent or the intensity that is claimed in the West. It does show that Iran has held out for all these years, against sanctions and military attacks and assassinations, and and they've held together. They've survived these things in the past, and I expect they will. I think it does show that Iran is more vulnerable than Russia. Russia is a special case just because it's basically a continental power. You could actually just stop all trade, between Russia and the rest of the world, and Russia would survive. It would suffer economic consequences, but it just has so much territory, so much in the way of resources, and such a large industrial base, and that it would survive, and it would probably, do pretty well. Not nearly as well as it's doing, but it would do pretty well. Iran is different. It's a smaller country with resources, with capabilities, but the sanctions do really exact a price there. Now, I think over time, and especially with the rise of BRICS and the establishment of this north-south corridor that the Iranians and the Russians are working on right now, these problems will be overcome. But in the short run, the sanctions are hurting Iran.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we can end it there unless there's anything else.
I think that's fine.
Actually, one last thing. There's a question from one of our viewers that wanted to know what were your favorite books of 2025, and anything you recommend for 2026 that you're looking forward to reading.
Okay. Well, there are quite a few books that I could recommend. There's one that I just finished, and at some point we'll talk about, and that is it's a life of Stepan Bandera, the life and afterlife of Stepan Bandera. Maybe I can show.
Sure.
Yeah, right here. It's quite.
Okay. That looks like a dad book to me, not one that I would
right.
pick up.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. So it's quite a very detailed, biography, but more than a biography of him, because it says the afterlife, that he became sort of, after he died, he became in some ways more important than he was during life. And that's true to this day. He is, just the other day, in fact, he was born on January 1st. So every New Year's in Ukraine is actually marked by the new Ukraine, not the Soviet Ukraine, but the new Ukraine is marked with celebrations in honor of Stepan Bandera, torchlit parades and that kind of thing. So again, he is a very, very important part of Ukraine's history, but not only its history, its present reality. And I think this is a very, very useful book, and coming to understand, how the role that he plays and continues to play in Ukraine. And then another book that I just started reading is this.
Waiting for Hitler, Stalin.
Yeah.
By Stephen Kotkin.
Yeah, no, it's excellent. Again, it's massive, but fascinating. I guess I have to say it doesn't have I will continue to read it. It doesn't have so much a direct connection to Ukraine. Though Ukraine was always a very important part of the Soviet Union. But just to understand Russia, Russia's past and its relationship is, again, Stalin is just such an important figure in making Russia what it is today. Both, yeah, it says to a great extent, he's obviously was a negative influence, but anyway, I got a ways to go, so I won't get into that.
Okay. Any
I'm
other
just
books?
starting to wrestle with those issues right now.
Anything else you read? Provoked, I know, last year as well. Any other good books that you read?
Uh, yeah, well, there's Glenn Deason's book, which is the Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. And that's very good. Glenn Deason is a very, I think, he's a real, let's say, a very powerful theorist. He's somebody. That's what you get here. He's a political scientist. So it just he provides a framework for understanding all these issues and the rise of the BRICS and the reasons, the collapse of the old world and the failure to address. To establish a new security architecture. Again, it's the way he looks at it as a political scientist, not as a historian. But I found that very, very valuable too.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed Glenn Deason's interviews. So,
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we can end it there.
Sure.
Please like, comment, subscribe. If you want to help me out and become a subscriber, it'd be much appreciated. I'm hoping that eventually I can make this podcast a real full-time thing for me. I'm kind of transitioning from work in China. It's been tough, so I'm hoping that this year I can make that change. So if you want to help that, become a subscriber. You can go to the Substack and become a paying member there, and you can put your own amount if you want as well. Okay, thank you very much. All right, Dad, have a good rest of your day. Great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.